My husband brought me to the hospital gala. Just smile and nod, you are just a housewife, he said coldly. The anonymous donor arrived in a tuxedo. He walked past the doctors, hugged me tightly, and cried. I built this wing for you, Sarah. You were the only one who believed in me 40 years ago. I never married because of you. My husband turned pale, his champagne glass trembling. The ballroom fell silent. Wesley's fingers dug into my shoulder. A bruising reminder of my place. The golden chandeliers cast sharp, unforgiving shadows across the marble floor. I could smell the expensive lilies and the metallic tang of Wesley's sudden sweat. He tried to pull me back, but his strength failed against the weight of the room's gaze. Harrison didn't let go. His tuxedo felt warm, a stark contrast to the icy silk of my gown. I hadn't heard the name Sarah in decades. To everyone here, I was merely a shadow. Now, the shadow was bleeding light. Wesley cleared his throat, a sharp, practiced sound meant to command attention. He forced a thin smile that did not reach his panicked eyes. He claimed there was a misunderstanding and tried to introduce me as his wife, Clarissa. Harrison ignored him entirely. He kept his hands on my shoulders, searching my face for the girl I used to be. The prestigious doctors began to whisper behind their hands. Their respect for Wesley was visibly curdling into curiosity. I felt my frozen heart finally shatter. The air in the ballroom grew heavy and thin. I remembered the anatomy textbooks Wesley made me burn before our wedding. He told me medicine was a man's world, and I lacked the stomach for it. Harrison's presence proved that was a lie. He looked at me with a reverence that felt like a localized earthquake. People were filming the scene on their phones now. My husband's reputation was a glass house, and Harrison had just thrown the first stone. Wesley looked small. Harrison pulled a small, battered notebook from his pocket. He showed me the first page, covered in my youthful, ambitious handwriting. I had forgotten I gave it to him during our final semester. It contained my original research on pediatric care, the very foundation of this new wing. Wesley's face shifted from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. He realized the donor wasn't just a benefactor. Harrison was a witness to the theft of my life. The pearls on my neck felt like lead. I stepped away from Wesley's shaking hand for the first time in 40 years. I didn't look back at the man who had erased me. I looked at the man who had built a monument to my ghost. The crowd parted like a dark sea as I followed Harrison toward the stage. My husband called my name, but the voice sounded like a fading echo. I reached up and unfastened the cold pearls. I let them fall onto the floor. I was no longer just a housewife. The black Mercedes felt like a pressurized chamber as we sped away from the hospital. Wesley gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He did not look at me. The silence was heavy with the scent of his expensive cologne and the sour tang of panic. I stared at my bare neck in the window reflection. The skin looked pale without the pearls. Wesley finally spoke, his voice a jagged blade of suppressed rage. He called me a fool. He began to drive faster through the dark, tree-lined streets of our neighborhood. Wesley insisted that Harrison was a predator looking for a scandal. He claimed the embrace was a calculated insult to his medical standing. I watched the streetlights flicker across his face like strobe lights. He looked older and more desperate than I had ever seen him. He told me to stay silent. He demanded that I never mention the name Sarah again. The car swerved slightly as he hit the brakes. We reached the house, but the tension did not break at the front door. Wesley paced the marble entryway like a caged animal. He accused me of having a secret affair decades ago. I stood by the mahogany table and felt a strange, cold calm. I asked him why Harrison called me a doctor. Wesley froze mid-step. His eyes darted toward the stairs. He told me it was a delusional fantasy. He said I was lucky he married a failure like me. I climbed the stairs while he poured a glass of amber scotch. My objective was clear. I needed to find my old life. I reached the attic door and felt the dust settle on my skin. The air was stale and smelled of forgotten things. I searched through the boxes of holiday decor and winter coats. I found a locked trunk tucked behind a stack of old rugs. It was heavy. It felt like a coffin for the girl I once was. I used a heavy screwdriver to pry the rusted latch open. Inside lay my old medical textbooks from 40 years ago. They were supposed to be burned. Wesley told me he threw them away before our wedding. I touched the leather covers and felt a jolt of electricity. My fingers brushed against a thick, cream-colored envelope at the bottom. It was addressed to Sarah Tonson. The seal was broken. Someone had already read my private mail. I held my breath. I pulled out the letter and realized it was from Johns Hopkins. It was an official acceptance into the pediatric residency program. The date was from 39 years ago. I had been ranked first in my entire class. Wesley had told me I was rejected by every hospital. He told me my grades were too low for medicine. He lied to ensure I would never leave his side. I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. He was coming for the trunk. I tucked the letter into the waistband of my dress just as he entered. Wesley looked at the open trunk and his face twisted into a mask of fury. He asked what I was doing in the dust. I looked at the books and then at his shaking hands. I realized he didn't just hide my past. He stole my entire future to build his own comfort. I didn't feel afraid. I felt a cold, sharp hunger for justice. Wesley stepped toward me with a dark, silent warning. The attic felt like a narrowing tomb as Wesley loomed in the doorway. He stared at the pried lock with a mixture of loathing and absolute terror. His heavy breathing filled the cramped space, smelling of bitter scotch. I felt the crisp edge of the hidden letter pressing against my skin. It was a physical reminder of his betrayal. He asked me to step away from the trash. His voice was a low, vibrating threat that signaled a loss of control. Wesley moved toward the trunk, his eyes darting to my empty hands. He reached out to grab my arm, but I pivoted toward the shadows. My objective was simple. I had to reach the stairs without him sensing the stolen document. He claimed he was only trying to protect me from old disappointments. He told me the past was a poison that would destroy our present. I saw his hand tremble as he brushed the dust from my anatomy books. The air grew thicker with the scent of mold and old paper. Wesley's facade of the protective husband was crumbling into something jagged and sharp. He insisted that Harrison was a liar who wanted to embarrass our family name. I watched him kick one of the textbooks aside with a heavy, dull thud. He demanded that I come back downstairs and play my part. He needed me to be silent. He needed me to be invisible again for his sake. Then, the power balance shifted with a single, ringing sound. My phone buzzed in my pocket, illuminating the dark corner with a cold, blue glow. I pulled it out and saw a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was a digital photo of a younger Harrison and me. We were standing in front of the Johns Hopkins Library, smiling with genuine hope. The sender asked if I remembered the day. We promised to change the entire world together. I looked at the screen, and then at the man who had erased that girl. Wesley saw the image and his face turned a bruised, ugly shade of purple. He realized Harrison was already in direct contact with me. The secret wasn't just in a trunk, it was in the air. I told him I knew about the letters he had burned. His eyes widened with a desperate, animalistic fury. He didn't deny it. He simply told me that I belonged to him. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his chest in the narrow passage. He didn't try to stop me this time. The weight of the letter in my waistband felt like a loaded weapon. I went down to the kitchen and drank a glass of cold, metallic water. I needed to see Harrison again. I needed to know the full extent of the damage Wesley had done. The house felt like a stranger's museum. Every portrait was a curated, painted lie. I heard the garage door open, and the heavy roar of Wesley's Mercedes as he sped away. He was running toward a crisis he couldn't fix with a scalpel. I sat at the granite island and pulled out the crumpled acceptance letter. My hands were finally steady as I read my own name. I realized Harrison hadn't just built a hospital wing for a ghost. He had built it for a woman who was finally waking up. Then, the front doorbell rang twice. The doorbell echoed through the hollow kitchen like a gunshot. I smoothed the stolen letter against my thigh and moved toward the foyer. Through the sidelight, I saw a familiar silhouette standing under the porch light. It was Harrison. He looked tired but resolute in the cool night air. I opened the door, and the scent of rain and cedar rushed inside. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at me with a profound, knowing sorrow. Harrison stepped inside and handed me a thick, manila folder. He explained that he had spent decades tracking the administrative trail of my lost career. I opened the file on the mahogany table. Inside were copies of every recommendation letter and fellowship offer I never received. My objective was finally within reach. I needed to see the full architecture of Wesley's deception. Harrison pointed to a signature on a rejection notice. It was a forgery of my own name. The pressure in my chest intensified as I turned the pages. I saw a formal request to withdraw my application from the residency board. It was dated 2 weeks before our wedding. Wesley had signed it as my representative. The room seemed to tut on its axis. Harrison watched me with a steady, grounding presence. He told me that he tried to reach me back then. He sent 3 letters to my apartment. I never saw any of them. Then, a new detail changed everything. Harrison pulled out a final document from the back of the folder. It was a legal non-disclosure agreement Wesley had forced a junior clerk to sign 40 years ago. The clerk had seen Wesley intercepting the mail at the university office. Wesley had paid for the man's silence for years. The power balance shifted instantly. This wasn't just a domestic lie. It was a documented, criminal conspiracy to defraud a medical student. I realized Wesley's prestigious career was built on the bones of my ambition. He didn't just want a wife. He wanted to eliminate his most talented competitor. Harrison told me the board was willing to review the case. They were horrified by the evidence of professional misconduct. I looked at the granite walls of my home and felt nothing but disgust. The house was a cage built with stolen bricks. I reached for my coat. I was leaving tonight. We walked toward Harrison's car as the rain began to fall. I felt the heavy weight of 40 years lifting off my shoulders. I was no longer a shadow in a cardiologist's house. I was Sarah Thompson again. Harrison promised to take me to the hospital archives. He wanted me to see the research wing in person. We pulled out of the driveway. Just as Wesley's headlights aired at the end of the block. He was coming back. The car accelerated and the neighborhood blurred into a streak of wet asphalt. I didn't look back at the Mercedes. My eyes were fixed on the folder in my lap. Harrison's phone chimed with an urgent notification. He checked the screen and his jaw tightened. He told me that Wesley had just filed an emergency injunction. He was trying to claim I was mentally unfit to make my own decisions. The war had moved to the courthouse. The rainy streets blurred as Harrison drove toward the hospital. My objective was to secure the physical evidence before Wesley's injunction froze my life. The tires hissed on the wet pavement, a rhythmic sound that did not calm my racing heart. Harrison gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the mirrors. Wesley's headlights were no longer visible. But his influence felt like a suffocating blanket. He was using the legal system to cage me one last time. We arrived at the medical center's back entrance. The facility was a sprawling labyrinth of glass and steel. Harrison led me past the sleeping security kiosks and toward the new pediatric wing. My heels clicked on the polished linoleum, echoing in the vast, empty halls. The scent of antiseptic was sharp and familiar. It It reminded me of the dreams Wesley had surgically removed. We reached a heavy oak door marked Private Archives. Harrison fumbled with his electronic keycard. The light flickered to life inside the windowless room. Steel cabinets stood in long, intimidating rows. My pressure rose as I realized the scale of the task. We had to find the original 1986 file before the morning shift arrived. Wesley's injunction would be served at dawn, making any search illegal. I pulled open a drawer and began to sort through the dusty folders. Harrison checked the computer terminal for the index. The clock on the wall ticked. Then, the power balance shifted with a single discovery. I found a blue folder tucked behind a stack of inactive records. It was not a medical file. It was a private log kept by the former head of admissions. He had recorded every phone call made by Wesley Hartwell regarding my application status. Wesley had not just intercepted mail, he had personally bribed the department head to ensure my name was removed from the final roster. I gasped. The new detail gave me the leverage I needed to fight. Wesley had committed systemic fraud across multiple decades. Harrison looked over my shoulder and his face turned grim. He told me this log was enough to strip Wesley of his medical license. It was the smoking gun that proved a criminal conspiracy. We took photos of every page with our phones. My hands were finally warm with the heat of victory. I was no longer a victim. We prepared to leave, but the sound of the elevator chime stopped us cold. The red lights on the security panel began to flash. Someone was accessing the archive floor with a master override code. I knew the heavy rhythm of those footsteps. It was Wesley. He had guessed where I would go. He was not coming to talk or apologize. He was coming to destroy the only evidence that could ruin his perfect, fraudulent life. The door handle turned slowly, making a sharp, metallic sound. Harrison stepped in front of me, but I pulled him back. I held the blue folder to my chest like a shield. I wanted Wesley to see the truth in my hands. The door swung open and my husband stood there, drenched and trembling. He held a legal document in his left hand and a lighter in his right. He smelled of smoke and rain. He looked like a dying man. Wesley stood in the doorway. His silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent hum of the corridor. The lighter in his hand sparked, a small dancing flame that looked alien in this sterile room. He smelled of rain and desperation, his expensive suit ruined by the storm. My objective was to protect the blue folder at any cost. I clutched the evidence against my ribs, feeling the sharp corners dig into my skin. Wesley didn't speak. He only stared at the documents with a predatory, hollow gaze. The air in the archive room became heavy with the smell of butane. Wesley stepped forward, his leather shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. He claimed that the documents were lies forged by a jealous rival. He demanded that I hand over the folder for the sake of our shared life. I saw the muscles in his jaw twitching with a frantic rhythm. Harrison moved to block his path, but I signaled for him to wait. I wanted Wesley to hear my voice. The flame crawled closer to the edge of the lighter's metal casing. Wesley's voice dropped to a low, manipulative whisper that usually worked on me. He promised that we could go home and forget this long, dark night ever happened. He said my mind was playing tricks because of the gala's excitement. I looked at the man I had served for 40 years and felt a sudden, profound revulsion. He wasn't trying to save me. He was trying to bury his own sins again. Then, the power balance shifted with a high, pitched mechanical whine from the ceiling. A security camera above the cabinets pivoted toward Wesley. Its red recording light blinking steadily. Harrison pointed to the lens and told Wesley that every action was being broadcast to the hospital's main security hub. Wesley froze, the lighter still raised in a threatening arc. His professional reputation was his only true god, and it was watching him. He realized he could not burn the truth without incinerating himself. I took a step toward him, emboldened by the watchful eye of the camera. I told him that I had already sent digital copies to 3 different lawyers. The folder in my hands was just a physical echo of a digital storm. Wesley's hand began to shake, and the lighter finally flickered out. He looked small and frail under the white lights. The prestigious cardiologist was gone. In his place stood a thief who had been caught in the middle of a heist. Wesley dropped the lighter, and it hit the floor with a hollow, plastic click. He pulled the emergency injunction from his pocket and ripped it into jagged pieces. The paper snow fell around his feet, as useless as his threats. He begged me to think about what this would do to the hospital's funding. He was still bartering with levs that weren't his to trade. I told him the hospital was fine. It was his residency in my heart that was over. Harrison checked his phone and informed us that the police were downstairs. The security team had flagged the master key override as a potential breach. Wesley's eyes darted toward the exit, but there was nowhere left to run. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the ghost of the man I thought I loved. He asked if I would testify against him in court. I didn't hesitate. I told him that I would tell the whole, unvarnished truth. The mid-scene turn arrived when a voice crackled over the intercom system. It wasn't security. It was the chief of staff, Dr. Lennox, who had been alerted by the server. She had seen the logbook on the screen during our digital upload. She informed Wesley that his surgical privileges were suspended effective immediately. The hospital was already distancing itself from his shadow. Wesley slumped against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. He looked like he was having a stroke. I moved to help him out of habit. But Harrison held my arm firmly. We were no longer responsible for his collapses. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant wail of a siren. I looked at the blue folder one last time, and then handed it to Harrison. I was finished with the archives. I wanted to see the sky, even if it was still pouring rain. We walked past my husband without a single word of comfort. We reached the lobby just as the glass doors slid open for the officers. Wesley was being escorted out the back by the night guards. I saw the flashing blue lights reflecting off the puddles on the sidewalk. Harrison asked where I wanted to go now that I was free. I looked at the new wing, glowing in the distance. A micro twist occurred when Harrison's assistant ran up with a new legal brief. Wesley hadn't just sabotaged me. He had emptied our joint accounts, leaving me with zero. The cold realization of the empty bank accounts hit me harder than the hospital gala's shocking revelation. Wesley had worked with the surgical precision of a thief to ensure I had nothing left but the clothes on my back. My objective was to find a place of refuge before his legal team could block my every move. Harrison gripped my hand, his palm warm against my trembling skin. He promised that money was merely paper and could be replaced. I didn't feel relieved. I felt entirely naked. We drove to a small, private hotel located far from the affluent neighborhood I had called home for 40 years. The rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof of Harrison's sedan. I stared at the passing streetlights, realizing that every luxury I owned had been a bribe for my silence. Harrison checked us in using a name I hadn't used since college. I stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence was deafening. The next morning brought a fresh wave of administrative pressure. Harrison's legal team arrived at dawn with stacks of documents and bitter coffee. They explained that Wesley was filing for a contested divorce, claiming I was the one who had abandoned the marriage. He was trying to frame my professional return as a symptom of a mental breakdown. The pressure escalated as I realized he was still trying to control the narrative. He wanted the world to believe I was a fragile, broken woman. I spent the afternoon reviewing the hospital's board requirements for the new wing's director. My primary obstacle was a deep, systemic lack of a recent clinical track record. Wesley had ensured my medical license had expired decades ago. To lead the wing, I needed a temporary emergency provisional license from the state board. Harrison's lawyers looked grim as they discussed the timeline. Then, a mid-scene turn arrived in the form of a phone call from an old, retired professor. He had kept my original thesis. The professor explained that my research on pediatric neural pathways had been cited in hundreds of papers over the years. I was not a ghost in the medical community. I was a foundational figure whose work had quietly saved lives for 40 years. This new detail changed the power balance instantly. I was not a housewife trying to be a doctor. I was a doctor who had been hidden from her own legacy. My confidence surged like a tide. I was ready to fight. Harrison arranged a private hearing with the board members for that evening. We walked into the mahogany-lined room, and I saw the skeptical faces of men who had dined with Wesley for decades. They looked at my modest suit and my tired eyes. I opened my leather portfolio and placed my original, handwritten thesis on the table. I didn't ask for their permission. I spoke with the authority of someone who knew the science better than they did. The room grew very quiet. I explained how Wesley had suppressed my career to enhance his own standing. I showed them the evidence of the intercepted letters and the forged signatures. One board member, a woman who had always been cold toward me, finally spoke. She admitted that Wesley had always seemed too perfect. She realized that his brilliance was a stolen shadow. The board voted unanimously to reinstate my medical standing with an emergency provisional license. I was officially Dr. Sarah Thompson again. The victory felt like oxygen in a vacuum. We walked out of the hearing into a flurry of camera flashes. Wesley had tipped off the local press, hoping to catch me in a moment of public failure. Instead, he had provided the stage for my official return. I ignored the shouting reporters and kept my head high. Harrison stayed a respectful distance behind me, letting me own the moment. I felt the weight of 40 years, finally dissolving into the night air. I was no longer afraid of his shadow. We returned to the hotel to celebrate with a simple meal. I looked at the emergency certificate and touched the embossed seal. It was the first thing I had truly owned in 4 decades. Harrison raised his glass to the woman, who had refused to stay buried. We talked about the future of the wing and the children we would save. The path ahead was finally clear of Wesley's thorns. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since I was 20. A micro-twist occurred when a courier arrived with a final package from the house. It was not from Wesley. It was from our long-time housekeeper, Elena. She had managed to smuggle out my grandmother's wedding ring and a hidden ledger Wesley didn't know existed. The ledger contained a list of offshore accounts Wesley had been using for years. He hadn't just stolen my career. He had been laundering money through the hospital's charity funds. The war was no longer just about a divorce. It was a battle for the hospital's very soul. The golden morning light flooded the new pediatric wing of the Mitchell Medical Center. I stood at the center of the glass atrium, holding the ledger Elena had saved from the wreckage. My objective was to hand over the evidence of Wesley's money laundering to the federal agents. The building smelled of fresh paint and hope. Harrison walked toward me, his expression a mix of pride and exhaustion. He told me the agents were waiting in the boardroom. The wait was finally over. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I climbed the stairs to the executive floor. The primary obstacle was the hospital's board of directors, who feared a public scandal. They wanted to handle Wesley's exit quietly to avoid a drop in donor funding. I pushed open the double doors and saw the grim faces of the men who had ignored me for years. They urged me to reconsider the criminal charges for the sake of the institution. I realized they were choosing profit over truth. Then, the power balance shifted with a single notification on my tablet. The federal investigators had already matched the account numbers in my ledger to a series of offshore shells. This new detail meant the board no longer had a choice in the matter. Wesley was not just a disgraced husband, he was a liability to the federal government. The directors looked at the screen and retreated into a stunned silence. I didn't need their permission anymore. The truth was now a force of nature. The lead investigator took the physical ledger and thanked me for my courage. He informed me that Wesley had been taken into custody an hour ago. My husband had tried to flee to the airport with a suitcase full of cash. I felt a strange sense of emptiness, rather than the joy I had expected. The man I had served for 40 years was reduced to a news headline. Harrison stood by the window, watching the blue lights fade in the distance. I walked back down to the ward and looked at the faces of the children. This was the legacy I was supposed to have 4 decades ago. I was no longer Clarissa the housewife or Sarah the shadow. I was a doctor who had reclaimed her own name and her own soul. The lie that I was only valuable as a support system was finally dead. I felt the cool weight of the stethoscope around my neck. It felt right. It felt like home. Harrison met me at the exit and asked if I was ready for a fresh start. I looked at the hospital wing and then at the horizon. I told him I had clinical rounds to lead in the morning. He smiled, and for the first time, I didn't need to smile back to please him. I smiled because I was free. We walked into the sunlight together. A young intern rushed past us, accidentally dropping a file that listed me as the lead surgeon.